So how does an empire just pop up out of the desert and dominate the known world in less than 100 years? It's a massive question, one that historians have debated for a long, long time. Today we're diving into a really fascinating thesis from 1937 that looks past the usual answers of just faith and force. Instead, it finds the root of it all in a powerful social and economic revolution. Let's get into it.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off by really trying to grasp the sheer scale of this so-called miracle. Then we'll unpack the revolutionary idea at the heart of our source material. From there, we'll explore the economic drivers, take a fresh look at the methods of conquest, marvel at the incredible intellectual legacy, and finally, see how this whole thesis gets applied to the history of India.
First things first, to really get what this thesis is arguing, you have to understand the magnitude of what happened. I mean, we're talking about one of the fastest, most dramatic imperial expansions in the entirety of human history. It's kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, this quote from the historian H.A.L. Fisher, it just nails the feeling of the time. He calls them obscure savages, which tells you everything about how the Arabian tribes were viewed. One minute, they're seen as a disunified people on the fringes of civilization. 100 years later, they're the center of a global power. The shockwaves were immense.
And just look at this timeline. The speed is absolutely staggering. Prophet Muhammad dies in 632. Just 5 years later, boom, Syria and Jerusalem fall. A few years after that, Egypt. By 651, the entire Persian Empire, a superpower that had battled Rome for centuries, is gone. And by 711, they're all the way over in Spain. The pace is just breathtaking.
So this brings us to the big question, right? How did this happen? Was it just pure religious fervor and some brilliant generals, or was there something else going on under the surface? The source we're exploring today, that 1937 essay by M. N. Roy, suggests a very, very different answer.
Okay, so let's get into this revolutionary idea. How exactly does this thesis from 1937 flip the script on the conventional story of Islam's rise? Well, it offers a totally new way to think about the whole thing.
And this really gets to the heart of it. On the one hand, you have the common view, the story many of us heard, of religious fanaticism, of conquerors offering the Quran or the sword. But Roy's thesis completely reframes it. It argues that Islam wasn't just a religion, it was a revolutionary social and political movement that offered a real, tangible solution to the crises plaguing the crumbling empires of Persia and Byzantium.
So, what does he mean by a social revolution? Well, think about it like this. The old world was falling apart. You had corrupt politics, crushing economic systems, and a kind of spiritual burnout. In this view, Islam wasn't just something forced on people. For many, it was a welcome escape from all that decay, an offer of a new, and in many ways, a more just social order.
But you gotta ask, right? What was actually happening on the ground to spark a revolution like that? Well, according to this thesis, you have to look at the powerful economic engine that was revving up.
So picture pre-Islamic Arabia. It wasn't one unified country. It was a patchwork of tribes that were constantly at war with each other. Raiding and feuds were just a part of life. But its location was prime real estate, right at the crossroads of major trade routes. And one tribe in Mecca, the Quraysh, started to realize that organized trade was way more profitable than raiding. Pretty quickly, they saw that all the constant fighting was a huge roadblock to getting rich.
And here's the real kicker. All that fighting, it was just plain bad for business. If you want caravans to move safely and markets to be stable, you need peace. The old way of doing things just wasn't cutting it anymore. So for this new, powerful merchant class, peace wasn't some lofty dream. It was an urgent economic necessity.
So, what's the solution? How do you get hundreds of different tribes, each with their own local gods and ancient loyalties, to finally get on the same page? The thesis here is that the radical, simple idea of one single, all-powerful God was the perfect ideology for the job. It just erased all the old tribal divisions and created a brand new, unified identity, an identity under which business could boom.
And this practical, almost business-like approach, according to the thesis, also reshaped the methods of conquest themselves, challenging one of the most powerful images we have in history.
You know, we all have this image in our heads of conquerors on horseback shouting, "Convert or die," but the reality presented here was often a lot more nuanced. There was usually a third option on the table: pay a tax, a tribute, and in return, you get protection and you get to keep practicing your own religion. It was a pragmatic choice. After all, you can't really trade with people you've killed. And this wasn't just some vague idea. You can see it in the official orders. This command from Abu Bakr, the very first caliph, to his army is, well, it's pretty stunning. He's ordering them to be merciful, to protect civilians, and to preserve the economic foundations of the lands they conquer. That's the language of someone building a state, not just a marauder.
Let's take the fall of Jerusalem as a perfect case study. Look at the terms of surrender. It wasn't about forcing anyone to convert, it was about guaranteeing security, property rights, and freedom of worship. People kept their churches, their clergy, everything. Honestly, for a lot of the Christian communities in the region, the new rule was actually more tolerant than the Byzantine one they had just left.
Okay, so with all this stability and newfound prosperity, something else incredible starts to happen, and it leads to one of Islam's most profound and frankly often overlooked contributions to the world.
So here's something huge to remember. After the Roman Empire collapses, a huge amount of the scientific and philosophical knowledge of the ancient Greeks, we're talking Aristotle, Ptolemy, you name it, was basically lost to Europe. And it was the scholars in the new Islamic world who became the keepers of this incredible intellectual flame.
And this is how it happened. It was an amazing journey for knowledge itself. Greek texts were actively hunted down, collected and translated into Arabic. But, and this is so important, thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes didn't just copy them. They debated them, they commented on them, they expanded them, creating massive new fields of study. And centuries later, it was these Arabic versions that made their way back into Europe, helping to light the spark of the Renaissance.
And this quote from the great philosopher Averroes just perfectly captures the mindset. This wasn't about shutting down inquiry. The study of science, of reason, of the natural world, that was seen as the highest possible form of worship. It was a worldview that celebrated rational thought.
All right, for our last piece here, the thesis takes this whole framework, this socioeconomic lens, and applies it to a totally different context, the arrival of Islam in India.
The argument here is pretty consistent. Islam didn't just show up in India with swords drawn. It arrived in a society that was dealing with its own deep-seated problems. For the lower castes, who were living under the incredibly harsh restrictions of Brahmanical law, Islam's core message of social equality wasn't just an idea. It was a sociological program, a genuine offer of liberation.
So, at the end of the day, the thesis argues that a huge driver of its success in India wasn't forced conversion. It was a conscious choice made by millions of people who are looking for a way out of a very rigid and oppressive social system. Once again, it was about offering a solution to a pre-existing social crisis.
And that really brings us full circle, doesn't it? When we look at any major historical movement, not just through the lens of its beliefs or its battles, but through the real-world social and economic conditions that gave rise to it, how does that change our perspective? It pushes us to see history less as a series of miracles or mysteries, and more as a very human story of people responding to the deep material needs of their time.